Well, good evening, everybody. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome once again to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And tonight we have a little change of plans. I'm going to be reading from the new book, JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia by Dr. Greg Poulgrain. And we've been reading this, concentrating on the chapter 3, Dulles, de Mohrenschildt, and oil. And so we are still in that chapter. We've got a little bit more of that chapter to read. And that's what I'll do tonight. And also to let you know that Garland Nixon is fine. He had a emergency plumbing problem at his home, some emergency that he had to rush and attend to. And he's very sorry he couldn't make it tonight. But we'll be starting our series then next Monday night at 8 p.m. Garland Nixon and myself for a 1-hour discussion of current events and what's behind them. I really look forward to it. Garland's got a heck of a head on his shoulders, and he's also got a lot of terrific experience. He has forensic experience. He's an investigator and a lead investigator and a teacher of criminal justice. So a person to be respected and listened to, and I really, really gained a lot out of every time I look at his show. And I'll have to say again, there's 2 recent shows that he did. If you haven't seen them, the first one is called Question for Lefties. And the second one is the most recent one. And the name has to do with the impeachment. And he really just breaks down the impeachment document itself and shows how there's no way that the impeachment managers proved their case. Well, anyway, speaking of case, I got a new case from Olivia. She said, John, you know what? You got to try some different things. And so I said, Olivia, what do you have in mind? And she said, well, try some Virgil's orange soda. So she carried it over to me and said, here, John, try this out. And so thank you very much, Olivia. And well, that means you're welcome. Yeah. Okay. All right. But you can't take over the whole show now. Okay. But she's right. Virgil's orange soda is every bit as good as Virgil's black cherry soda. So we've decided to make Virgil's orange soda our sponsor for tonight. And everybody can rely on Virgil's. It tastes just like that perfect cream soda that you used to get when you were a kid. And I'm sure you'll agree that Virgil's is what'll carry you through when nothing else will. And thank you again, Olivia, for turning me on. So tonight we're going to do something I am always happy to do, and that is to get back to the de Mohrenschildt story, because I just don't think that people recognize yet that he's a huge figure. He's almost up there with Rockefellers in terms of how powerful he was on the world stage, even though he used to be, a very wealthy, noble, white Russian member of the inner circle of the Romanovs. His father did, and grew up in the oil business. His only fame is that he was the mentor of Lee Harvey Oswald. But now we see that Allen Dulles knew him in 1920. And Allen Dulles then would have nurtured that relationship so that whenever he needed a certain thing done, he would get in touch with de Mohrenschildt. Well, the oil in Indonesia became the Rockefellers' next target. And they didn't really know the extent of it, but they knew that there was a lot of wealth there, not just oil, but minerals and, undiscovered, unexplored territory. So the next frontier for the oil companies is to go to Indonesia, but Indonesia was already owned by the Dutch. And so we read through some of the machinations that got a foot in the door for the Standard Oil Company, and that involved Allen Dulles and his dual roles as a State Department employee and a lawyer for Standard Oil. He didn't have any trouble with conflicts of interest because he saw it all as the same thing. Well, George de Mohrenschildt continued his education after the Russian Revolution and drove him out of Russia, along with all the other White Russians. And so he got advanced education in his business, the petroleum business. And come lo and behold, when he ends up going on an exploratory mission for the Rockefellers in Indonesia, he just happens to find this amazing, great oil field. He's just good at it. He's really good at finding oil. So it's this well that we read about the last time. It's called Sele 40, SELE number 40. And we'd read the last time about how when the Japanese came and they were developing it and they were getting oil out of it. And then along where we stopped, the Americans now come in to the area. So let's pick up reading here on page 80 and see what else we can learn about George de Mohrenschildt, the Indonesian oil, General MacArthur. And along with General MacArthur came a certain lieutenant in the Navy on the flagship USS Nashville, and his name was Thomas F. O'Loughlin, Jr. Dutch historian Lo de Jong has recounted that in September 1942, the Dutch Chief of Naval Staff visited Admiral King of the U.S. Navy to inform him that oil discovered in the Vogelkop was of such high quality that it could be used without refining. Was this a reference to Sele 40, 1 year after its discovery? Both it and Mogollon had oil with no sulfuric impurities and needed no refining. There was compelling evidence to indicate that Sele 40, discovered but not announced publicly before the Japanese invasion, had been brought to the attention of the Allied commander of the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur. The Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, based in Australia for the duration of the war, followed in the wake of General MacArthur's advance through New Guinea. MacArthur's headquarters in Hollandia, Netherlands, New Guinea, that is near the site of his first landing in the deepwater port de Papra, became the official Dutch governor's residence in the new capital, replacing Manokwari. The second landing in May 1944 on the island of Biak also left its legacy of war, an international airport, and the third landing in July on the Vogelkop at Sauzapur was not far from Sorong, which was becoming the oil town on the westerly tip of the island. And now, thanks for pulling that map up, Andy. That's the one I wanted to just indicate what's going on here. If you see in the upper left-hand corner, there is the part of New Guinea that's called the Bird's Head, or Vogelkop in Dutch. And that is the place where the July landing happens. And it is at that point that the Nashville has joined the 7th Fleet there, and MacArthur makes it his flagship, and that is when my father arrives on the scene. So just after the Biak landing in June is when Nashville joins once again to the 7th Fleet, this time with my dad as one of the officers. So then they land there on the beak, on the bird's head, as up in the upper left. And that is the area where we're talking about here. Accompanying the U.S. Army under MacArthur was a contingent of geologists who set about compiling data on West New Guinea, and they continued doing so until the early 1950s. An Australian intelligence report noted this symbiotic relationship between the American military and mining interests. Quote, United States oil and metal interests intend to demand to share in the disposal of the petroleum, metal, and mineral resources of Asia, of Axis-controlled areas, wrote Carl C. Dodd, the official military historian of the American Corps of Engineers. He has noted that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff gave special consideration to the westerly tip of New Guinea. During late 1943 and early 1944, MacArthur's planners had centered their attention on the Japanese base at Sorong on the westerly tip of the peninsula, and in the United States, the Army Service Forces, with the approval of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likewise did a good deal of planning. MacArthur's men surveyed the area around Sorong, and within 3 months they had produced a provisional map of the region in October 1944. On it, clearly annotated, was the Sele oil field, adjacent to the Sele Strait on the western tip of the Vogelkop. It was precisely where the road had been constructed, coming 9 miles inland from Kasim. On the area close to the narrowest part of Sele Strait was the information, quote, reported old oil surfaced, indicating that oil had flowed once to the surface from a discovery site that was then sealed. Having confirmed the location, the expected output, and the quality of the oil, MacArthur proposed to bring a contingent of 3,300 men of the Engineer Petroleum Production Depot from California to Sorong in order to produce oil for the American military advance on Japan. Because the expected output was clearly focusing on Sele 40, when the plan was abandoned in July of 1944, it was not because the potential for oil there had suddenly dissipated. On the contrary, the change in plans was the beginning of a concerted effort to conceal the Sele oil field. It was the beginning of the battle over sovereignty of Netherlands New Guinea, which continued into the 1960s. A second official history of the U.S. military provides an accurate estimate of the expected oil output, accurate because it matched the eventual Sele output when it was, quote, rediscovered in the 1970s. With limited effort, the wells could be expected to bring in some 16,000 barrels of crude oil per day, with additional development, about 25,000 barrels. The Netherlands suffered from a shortage of oil during the 1945-49 Indonesian War of Independence, particularly in the early stages, and this made the Dutch more vulnerable to external political pressure from Washington. Oil in southern Sumatra was not available until after the first police action in 1947, and in central Sumatra until the second police action of December of 1948. Further delays in achieving production from war-damaged oil sites in Dutch-occupied eastern Indonesia made U.S. oil imports imperative. New Guinea oil remained unavailable until the last week of 1948, when the Klamono came on tap, a heavy oil producing at 4,700 barrels per day without the advantage of being free of sulfur. The 36-mile pipeline from Sorong to Klamono took 2 years to construct, twice the estimated time. Previously, access was by barge, and Klamono oil was transported to Australia to alleviate the post-war shortage. The oil companies declared themselves powerless to effect any change favoring the Dutch struggle to hold Java or any part of the former Netherlands East Indies. Because oil was exported to Australia, the oil companies managed to widen the diplomatic gulf between Australia and the Netherlands. Another important effect of this oil company strategy was to isolate the Australian-controlled eastern half of New Guinea from the western half, Netherlands, New Guinea. So I just wanted to make the comment about MacArthur finding this tremendous source of oil that could have fueled the American war effort from then on to the end of the war. It is an amazing amount of oil at Selle 40, and yet when he started to try to develop it, somebody put the kibosh on down it and killed the project. And that is, I think, the hand of the Rockefeller powers behind the scenes who did not want that oil to go into the U.S. military without them first having gotten control of it and being the brokers of it. After President Sukarno was ousted in 1965 to 66, the NMGPM, that is Alan Dulles' Dutch appearing, but actually Rockefeller, a front for the Rockefeller oil companies, the NNGPM handed over all the former geological reports compiled during the years of exploration to Petromina, who occupied the Selle site until its rediscovery by Petromer Trend in the early 1970s. Petromer Trend and 6 other companies had signed contracts in West New Guinea before the end of 1971. Indeed, 2 companies signed in 68, even before the 1969 Act of Free Choice, and their concession areas were vast tracts of land. The concession area for one of the 2 pre-69 companies was 125,000 square miles, or 3/4 of the size of California. Petromer's area was 1,957 square miles. Petromer's concession was just 1% of the combined area of the other 2 companies. Yet it was a bonanza. 7 companies began oil exploration in West New Guinea after the end of the Dutch colonial rule. But Petromer Trend was the first to strike oil, and its 100-to-1 chance scooped the biggest prize of all. It goes without saying that Petromer Trend's contract area covered the original Selle 40 and nearby oil field generously. The ratio of holes that struck oil to the total number of drills was 14 to 17, or 1 to 1.2, which was unprecedented. An American engineer working on the prolific Qasim Jaya field declared in Newsweek, quote, "There's so much oil around here that we even struck oil in one of the geological holes." Now, next section is on a man named Michael Fomenko, and he also is part of the De Mohrenschildt story. I'll be with you in just a second. Well, it's nice to see Deborah Johnson in the chat tonight. Deborah, she's an archivist, and she's done a terrific job. She just sent me, and I've started to look at all of the digital archives that she created out of my personal Macduff archives. And a big job she took on, and I'm looking forward to exploring it. It's going to be very beneficial to us as we try to write the actual book, the actual life of Macduff, and that'll be our joint project. So, yeah. Okay, Michael Fomenko. There is a bizarre side story to the Celle 40 saga centered on Russian-born Michael Fomenko, a close relative of George de Morenschildt's wife, Jean Fomenko. In 1959, he paddled a canoe from Australia to the Netherlands, New Guinea, a prodigious feat, only to be placed under house arrest by a Dutch officer in charge of internal affairs at the time, Raphael Den Haan. In Brisbane in 2012, I interviewed Den Haan, who was 90 years old, to find out why Michael Fomenko went to the NNG in 1959. Did he know about the still unannounced oil discovery made by his uncle de Morenschildt in 1941? Den Haan lived in Brisbane because he had married an Australian woman whom he had met in Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, when he was the Dutch officer appointed to liaise with Australian authorities in neighboring PNG. He remembered the incident in 1959 when the lone adventurer Michael Fomenko, 29 years of age, traveled by canoe from Australia to Netherlands, New Guinea. His presence remained unknown for almost 3 months, but he finally was apprehended by Dutch authorities and flown to Hollandia. A check on his background showed he was of Russian descent from royal lineage, and it was decided that the young adventurer from Sydney would stay in Den Haan's house before being repatriated. Then Fomenko caused another controversy by wandering into the jungle, walking for 3 weeks, and meeting many Papuan village people. Quote, "He was the most fit human being I've ever seen in my life," Den Haan said. Despite the half-century that has passed since last seeing Michael Fomenko, Den Haan still expressed surprise and admiration for the young man's daring and sheer physical strength. Den Haan himself, as a young man, was a long-distance swimmer and readily acknowledged the canoeing incident as an unparalleled feat of endurance. Paddling a canoe from Australia across Torres Strait and westward along the coast of New Guinea, traveling for several months. Michael Fomenko had grown up in post-war Sydney as a teenager, and in the 1950s his all-round sporting prowess marked him as a likely contender for the Olympic decathlon. He had other ideas, however, partly inspired by Johnny Tarzan Weissmuller, but possibly also by Jean Fomenko. Den Haan did not comment on the possible motivation underlying Michael's visit to New Guinea, but he was willing to talk about the film star from the 1950s, Johnny Weissmuller, who definitely had inspired the young Michael. Having won Olympic gold medals and broken world records in swimming, Weissmuller became a Hollywood success as Tarzan and Jungle Jim. Weissmuller was born in Romania, at the western end of the Black Sea, and Michael Fomenko was born at the eastern end of the Black Sea, in Georgia. The Fomenko family was part of the great diaspora of Russian émigré population. Rather than being under Stalin, they settled in all corners of the earth. Eugenia was already married when she first went to New York. She kept her family name, Fomenko, rather than her married name, and changed her first name from Eugenia to Jean. In the fashion industry, she excelled, flying often to Europe and fashion centers of the world. As she explained to Jenner after he'd finished interviewing George, she met de Morenschildt in 1956 and married him in June 1959. Michael's father, Daniel, who was also a champion athlete, settled in Sydney with his family before World War II, and Michael's elder sister, Inessa, recalled their days fondly when she spoke to me about her athletic brother. The canoe that he paddled to New Guinea, she said, was one that he had made himself carved out of a tree. Michael Fomenko was the first in the news for making his way by canoe hundreds of miles along the coast of North Queensland. In the Canberra Times, it was reported Michael Fomenko on Horn Island, living with about 100 natives. Fomenko was surprised at all the fuss about his canoe journey and said he was sorry if he'd caused any inconvenience. From there, he paddled over to Netherlands, New Guinea. Den Haan explained that once apprehended, he was flown to the capital, Hollandia, to be repatriated back to Sydney. In April 1964, at the same time as George de Mohrenschildt was facing the Warren Commission, Michael Fomenko decided he wanted to return to West New Guinea, no longer Netherlands, New Guinea, because by this time the Dutch had been ousted and Indonesia was in control. Any publicity regarding Sele 40 would have changed history. Just his name, Fomenko, would have attracted attention because Jean was the wife of the key witness of the Warren Commission, which was in session at the very time. It was at this moment, according to Inessa Fomenko, Michael's sister, that Frank Bischoff intervened. He was the officer from Special Branch in Brisbane. That is a political wing of the Australian police force. He had training in Scotland Yard in the United Kingdom and was known to be in contact with intelligence agencies in Australia, UK, and the United States. Bischoff was notoriously corrupt, but only half a century later is the general public now aware of his misdeeds, inclined to label him as evil. Why did Frank Bischoff arrange for Michael Fomenko to be admitted to a mental hospital for 6 months, where the young man was subjected to electroconvulsive therapy? In the media, it was incorrectly claimed Michael's mother was responsible for this, and when informed of this, Michael refused to speak with his family for the rest of his life. Even his sister Inessa was unable to communicate with him. The Canberra Times simply announced that Michael Tarzan Fomenko will be detained at the Ipswich Special Mental Hospital for at least 6 months. When he was released, Michael Fomenko went to live in the jungle of North Queensland, where he remained for the next 50 years. He lived in the wild, always moving from place to place, often catching his food as he went. He did this for decades and became known as Tarzan, although in later years he was helped by having access to a disability pension. Few reporters were ever able to locate him, but in 2011, Frank Robeson met him. Quote, he was shocked to learn that Johnny Weissmuller had died in 1984. In 2016, Michael Fomenko, 86 years old, already 2/3 of the way walking from Cairns to Sydney, which is 1,500 miles, suffered a knee injury that caused him to stop in Gympie. He was admitted to the Coenda Aged Care Center, where I visited him briefly. Whether it was Bischoff's directive that caused his mental fragility or 50 years of solitude as a consequence of Bischoff's directive, I cannot say. We can only surmise why it was deemed necessary in 1964 to stop Michael Fomenko from returning to West New Guinea after the Dutch administration had been replaced by Indonesian. For those persons, not Indonesians, who were aware of Sele oil fields' potential to benefit the PKI, that is the Indonesian Communist Party, could Fomenko's presence have undermined Maeda's role in preventing the discovery of Sele? Bischoff's special branch were die-hard anti-communists, willing to follow instructions in line with their political precepts. On the other hand, if Michael Fomenko had gone to West New Guinea in 1964, inevitably he would have stirred public interest with his unusual family name in the news. Was the threat he posed simply from the possibility that his name might have been linked to Jean Fomenko, the wife of George de Mohrenschildt? Both were important witnesses in the Warren Commission. Hidden behind this linking of names, an investigation could easily have uncovered the fact that George and Alan Dulles had first met 40 years ago and undoubtedly would have started new lines of inquiry in the Warren Commission. Michael Fomenko died in 2018, romanticized in North Queensland, where he roamed for half a century as a Tarzan. He was a tragic figure, another fatality of West New Guinea. The idea that this man Fomenko knew something about all this oil and that therefore they shut him up by giving him electroconvulsive therapy is just another example of what I think happens just too much. And I can't help but sympathize with the family of people to whom that happens. I it's personal, and I what can I say? Alan Dulles is a person who had no or very little sense of humanity of people that were in his way. I mean, so that's what I think happened there, was that Dulles made the judgment, both in the case of Fomenko and then in the case of De Morenschelt in 1977, when he was about to testify at the church committee, that he knew too much, and so he had to be eliminated, and that's what they do. So George De Morenschelt, another, quote, suicide, unquote. So many we've read about. Well, once again, I apologize for tonight for not being able to have Garland, but these things do happen, and he's really sorry he couldn't do the show tonight. So thanks everybody for being with us tonight. And yeah, Deborah, you're right about Mohrenschelt is originally an Austrian name, but if you're looking into George de Mohrenschelt, look in Minsk, look in Byelorussia. Don't get distracted in Austria. And that would be my advice. All right, thanks. Good night, everybody.